All right, welcoming back Lawrence Grandpre, who, among other things, is the director of research for the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle based in Baltimore. Lawrence, good to see you again. Welcome back.
Always good to be in conversation with you, Jared. Thanks for having me.
So, as usual, whenever I hear you on In Search for Black Power or anywhere else, I'm often fascinated and challenged, and I appreciate that. And yesterday or the other day or whenever it was, I was actually, I don't actually know if it was live or I was watching it later, whatever. But you were on Breakthrough News recently, and I caught at least I think all of it, but maybe not the entire conversation you were having with Eugene and Rania about violence prevention and reduction in Black communities. And you made what I thought were very interesting, a very interesting argument about what does and does not work. So if we could just start with sort of the broad summary of what you were saying there, and then as I asked before we got on, I just would like you to walk me and us through how you are working all this out and what you're seeing and researching and what you are advocating be replicated. But yeah, so
Yeah,
please, yeah.
yeah. So this is in the context of what's happening in DC. And the go-to argument is, well, why do they need to be there? Crime is down. And I think part of what we need to do
That
is
is the
the left.
National Guard that Trump put in there.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. But the question is why? Because if the left, I mean, I was just thinking about it this morning. I don't think the left has anything to say about even the concept of criminology and why things decrease crime besides the root cause arguments the left goes to around poverty, inequality, things like that. I think that's important. But I think if we don't have a precise analysis that speaks to people's concerns about crime, then the liberals and the conservatives will actually co-opt some of those root cause arguments around inequality, homelessness. Because if we have to wait until we get universal basic income or redistribution of GDP to get public safety, then people are going to say, I can't wait that long. I need something, be it the National Guard or more police. And that's kind of what I see in conversations around DC, is that people are saying, like, look, all these homeless people, look, all these people who are on drugs. It makes me feel unsafe. It's like, we know that substance use or homelessness alone does not correlate necessarily to violent crime. But we're not having an actual conversation that explains why these record shattering declines in gun violence are declining, because we haven't redistributed the GDP. We haven't solved homelessness, but we're still seeing these record shattering declines in violence in certain cities in the USA. And without a clear explanation of that, people are going to use that to devalidate the leftist argument around the root cause argument. So what I'm trying to do is basically have an open invitation to the left to get serious about thinking through and talking through criminology and understanding why violence declines.
And this is what I thought was fascinating. So the left, that is what I would understand to be the real left, that is saying we need to get to these root causes for what causes all this violence and homelessness and houselessness and inequality, and and you're saying, oh, okay, yes, that's all well and good, but that is also discounting or diminishing what is actually being effective in the interim in creating record lows in violence in certain Black communities in the United States. So if you feel free to pick up and finish any of that, but if we could
Yeah,
also,
I'll just give you an
yeah,
example.
sure, go ahead.
So there's a guy named Alex. I think his last name is Caceres. He's part of Civil Rights Corps. He's on a lot of leftist media. He writes books on crime. And he has an analysis that cites a study that says that Medicare expansion is responsible. The states that expanded Medicare, that's actually responsible for decreasing crime in the states that expanded. And to me, it's like, I get what he's going for, but I actually don't understand the mechanism of decreased criminality just from expanding Medicare. Because we know you can be on Medicare and not get medical care. It's just you're on paper with Medicare, right? So I looked at the study. They have no explanation of the causal mechanism. And for what I can tell, to kind of feed the argument that I'm trying to explain, the states that expanded Medicare were also correlated to the states that decriminalized and legalized cannabis. So we're just seeing a lot less drug arrests in those states, and that's being seen as a drop in crime, right? So I think it's one of those things where, because Medicare for all fits within the leftist framework, and the way Breonna Joy Gray responded to that was like, oh, this is giving me life. This is so affirming, because it feeds my understanding that it's the root cause of inequality. That's the only way we ever solve crime. And it's like we can shoehorn analysis into like the Bernie agenda or a leftist agenda that does not ever have to actually engage grassroots Black civil society. And then I have to engage, again, this narrative that, BLM was kind of pointless, didn't lead to anything, but it was really those movements on the ground that forced cannabis decriminalization, cannabis legalization. We have seen arrest and incarceration has declined substantially. And part of the argument that I think needs to be added is part of what I'm saying is that what's happening on the ground, and this is completely independent even from the violence prevention services that have gotten funding, Black grassroots violence prevention services, when you have decreases in incarceration, these hyper incarcerated communities, some of these people who are formerly incarcerated come home and they have a informal network, at least in cities like Baltimore, of mentorship and violence prevention, completely independent of the nonprofit industrial complex, completely independent of the actual services that have been funded and are essential. But it is stopping the constant churn of people in and out of jail through hyper incarceration related to cannabis that stabilizes communities and allows for communal networks of mentorship and informal violence intervention. That's what we're seeing here in Baltimore. And that argument is necessary because when they say, we'll decarcerate sex work, we'll decarcerate drugs, but we're going to increase locking people up if they carry guns, that's actually harming the mechanism that's decreasing violence, because it is working class Black people that are going to be locked up for long sentences for those gun carrying crimes. And there's times that the left basically goes along, which would have seen as a liberal argument that's around focus police on the real bad guys that are carrying illegal guns, ignoring why it might be rational for someone in a violent neighborhood where, again, we have more guns in America than ever post-pandemic, increases in gun carrying. If you do this thing that liberals and I think unfortunately leftists fall into, which is stop locking up the poor people, stop locking up the people carrying drugs, you end up, again, retargeting Black communities for incarceration. But you can have like a liberal leftist veneer and sheen to it, which is what we are seeing as an attempt to backslide and to attack the very real work that, again, my argument is that Black mayors were basically forced into. Not that we should give credit to the neoliberal Black mayors, but they were forced into certain concessions around criminal justice reform at state and local levels by these movements of grassroots working class Black people that were oftentimes discounted by the left as ineffective. So we can talk about the formal violence intervention services, but I think that analysis is really important because in our desire to chalk up wins to the broader left, the broad, grassroots economic redistribution argument, we're ignoring the reality and materiality of communities and culture. That's the only way you can really describe the patterns of violence declines that we're seeing now.
So first of all, were you talking about the person you mentioned earlier? Did you say that was Alec Caracaccinis?
Yeah.
The author of Propaganda, that guy?
Yes. Yes,
oh,
yes.
okay. All right. I know I totally destroyed his name, so I apologize for that. Okay, so how do you, so on the one hand, how do we know that what Alec was arguing about Medicare expansion reducing crime is, if not wrong, insufficient? And then how do we know that decriminalizing cannabis decreases crime in the
we know
in some Black communities?
The paper has no causal mechanism to explain why Medicare will be linked to crime declines. The only one it posits is it's possible that Medicare expansion leads to more drug treatment, and that more drug treatment, which is covered by Medicare, can lead to crime declines. Now, from the studies I've seen, just being on Medicare does not actually lead to an increase of people receiving those services, right? So we're seeing an increase in Medicare coverage, but not necessarily an increase in people successfully matriculating through medical addiction care through Medicare. I mean, we know first of all that it should be a leftist argument that simply being on drugs does not make you someone likely to do crime, right? Simply being in a state of substance use dependency or addiction. And we also know that treatment in this country is really, really bad and genuinely very ineffective, right? So this idea that substance use treatment from Medicare will be responsible for violence declines, it's the only thing kind of posited in the paper, has no relationship to reality. And I think, again, what we also know through studies that have shown that it is in communities that have extremely high rates of incarceration, again, feeding an argument about the importance of looking to civil society. It is the civil society institutions that are shredded through hyper incarceration. So it is very difficult to like have community cohesion when you're constantly targeted people churning in and out of jail, hyper incarceration through drug arrests. So when you ratchet down the power of the community destruction, so the ability for the community to do, again, informal community care, like when I'm talking about when these OGs coming home and mediating conflict, but also just like nonprofits that are started by community, church groups, basketball leagues, like all these things are harder when you're targeted for hyper incarceration through things like cannabis criminalization. And again, if you actually look at the patterns of where the violence declines are occurring, you're seeing cities that are, disproportionately controlled by black mayors, disproportionately had a social equity focus on how they spent their federal American Rescue Plan Act funds. So it's not just decarceration, it's investing in communities that can rebuild the community fabric of those communities. And again, that was through, I think, in many ways, at least what I'm seeing here in Baltimore and what I think data shows, the Federal American Rescue Plan Act. And then not just doing violence prevention investments, but communities that, and again, it's hard to know exactly because it's not like they post that curriculum. But if you're in the space, certain cities have a more of a focus on grassroots, community oriented violence prevention as opposed to top down academic public health driven violence prevention programs, many of which oftentimes work with police. So cities like Newark, cities like, again, Baltimore's mixed, but I think we have a very strong violence intervention ecosystem from the bottom up that was funded for the first time ever. Part of the critical argument is what has changed. There's nothing has really changed except, I think, again, targeted decarceration in places that are like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, Maryland, through places that have decriminalized, legalized cannabis. But I think the real thing that has changed is never before have we seen any real funding for grassroots violence intervention services that have a cultural communal lens for the work they do. And for places that combine all of those dynamics, it is not a guarantee you see these like 50% violence declines, but the only places that have had these 50% violence declines have some mixture of these factors, particularly Newark, Philly, Baltimore, and Los Angeles, right? And so I think that given a huge chunk of the national murders are these big cities that have these big murder rates, the specific talking about the materiality of culture and the materiality of investing in these programs is an important response to the liberals when they say, I don't like what Trump is doing, but I still feel unsafe when I see homeless people. But it's also a response to the left, which is, again, going to lead us more towards Medicare for all, as if that's like a violence prevention methodology in of itself. It's not to say it's bad, but when community is demanding concrete solutions, not just for violence, but for how do we keep our youth alive? How do we re-socialize our youth? You have to give them investments that work within the framework of investments that they want to see, or they may turn to the police, they may turn to the National Guard. And I think part of the idea is the left needs to hear that and take that seriously, because investing in Black community sovereignty for youth programming and violence prevention is not always prioritized compared to universal economic redistribution programming.
All right. So on the one hand, I can't help at least, when I see what's happening in DC, I'm not seeing this as some sort of legit, even from a wrong reactionary right wing position, attempt to suppress violence and deal with violence in particularly Black community. This to me reads more as a broader attempt to play fascism, so to speak, and
Mm-hmm.
to distract perhaps from other issues that the president and his allies don't want people focused on, and in response even specifically to one of their own getting beaten up. It's
Mm-hmm.
like so this wasn't like, oh, we're concerned about what's happening in the Black community in DC, so let's try to figure this out, and our version is to send in troops. I've also seen overwhelmingly, and I wonder if anyone's ever going to do any study of this. And again, add this to the list of things I should do and probably will never do. But I would be fascinated to see, and maybe someone has done this, and someone can let me know, some sort of an analysis of DC's local news for how they're covering this. Because whenever I peep in, there seems to be a prevalence of voices that ostensibly come from the Black community that are saying this is a good thing, that they do want the violence in their community taken away, and more progressive or left voices are just kept out of the news, or balanced with these other voices. So that I'm just saying that. So I say that to say, though, I am interested if you could talk a little bit about what are these statistics you're seeing in terms of the drops in crime in certain cities, uh, that I and others might not be aware of. Because
Hmm.
often we hear about Chicago, everybody's getting killed in Chicago, or we hear about, whatever other city, but I don't feel like there's a lot of discussion about what you're talking about. So it's in some ways, to me, admittedly, in my own, narrow vision of things, headline
Yeah.
news, that there are these record breaking drops in violence in certain cities. So could you again talk about what these numbers are showing and where, and then maybe again reiterate a little bit about
Hmm.
what you think is happening there, and
Yeah.
why it should be duplicated, or you know.
So you hear a few talking points from the right that are important to address. Sometimes we ignore the right completely. So part of that argument is that, yeah, we're seeing violence declines, but they're from extremely high peaks of violence at post-pandemic. Youth carjacking, gun violence spiked in 2021, 2022. So seeing a decline from something that high doesn't really mean anything. They also say things like, well, the crime is declining because they're not arresting people, and they're just allowing it to happen. So for the first point, it is true that we had a peak of violence in 2020, 2021, 2022, and even that needs to be put in context. Like, if it is true that it's these formal and informal networks of community socialization and guidance that help deter crime, what happened with the pandemic? We all got stuck in our house, right? And so the ability to resuture those community networks helps describe the crime declines, right? And the important thing of the four cities I isolated, Baltimore, Newark, Philly, and LA, is that not only is crime declining compared to the post-pandemic bump, it is declining to genuine historic lows not seen for decades in those cities, right? So it's a difference between declining back, crawling back gains from the pandemic eroded, to genuine numbers never seen before. Like in Baltimore, the number is 300 murders a year, and we're a small city, right? And Baltimore is was almost under 200 last year, and it's looking to be under 200 this year in terms of murders, right? Newark, every time I look to Newark, because I think they are, for all people's concerns about Ross and his method of governance in terms of public safety and violence prevention ecosystems, they are, for me, the best practice in terms of bottom up community driven violence prevention. And every time I look at them, it's like, murders are very veritable. So 1 year of increased murders doesn't necessarily devalidate the model, but they keep going down in Newark. They cut their murder rate in half, and it's staying at half of what it was at its peak. That's just very rare because murders tend to be very variable, right? 10-20% variation is kind of common. And then I actually thought about it. I said, based upon my model, what I know about LA, based upon the organizing bottom up from like the Bloods and Crips peace treaty from the 90s and that strong community network, from what I know about my hypothesis based upon LA being rated as one of the more equitable people who distributed the ARPA funds, LA should have a violence decline. And I looked it up, not even knowing LA's numbers. LA is on track for a 60-year low in murders. 60-year low. That is different. That is something that it's not an accident. You're not hearing about it because it's happening under a regime of, I think, neither the right nor the left knows what to do about this, right? Because the right wants to chalk it up to tough on crime policing. Police numbers are decreased throughout the country because they're having a hard time recruiting and the boomers are retiring. So in terms of pure police numbers, almost throughout the entire country, police forces are down. Now, police spending is up, because they're replacing those cops with civilians. We can talk about that. But in terms of pure police force numbers, the number of uniformed police is down uniformly throughout the country. And again, it's variable. But in Philly, you have Krasner. Krasner is the opposite of a hardcore, tough on crime DA. Again, some cities have different arrangements of, you know, more pro police mayors, more pro police DAs. But again, we've tried all of that before. The only thing that is truly new is, again, this environment of taking the pressure off of these communities where the violence is clustered in communities that are hyper incarcerated. Even calling it mass incarceration is a bit of a misnomer. Because yes, it is mass incarceration. We still have mass incarceration because these long sentences we give to relatively minor violent crimes like assaults or just merely people carrying guns. But it's really targeted in the Black and brown communities that had the highest rates of violence. So specifically investing in the capacity of those communities to do a version of public safety that's bottom up through these folks that are doing this violence intervention, OGs, people in street organizations that are talking and mediating conflicts before they happen. Investing in that in a real way has never happened before, and these violence declines have never happened before. So to me, it is logical and necessary to link that point to why violence is declining. So we don't, not only do we not need National Guard, we don't need Hopkins, we don't need University of Chicago, we don't need these top-down public health bureaucracies co-opting and denaturing the work away from a conversation around the culture, spiritual, and political methodologies these folks are using on the ground to actually accomplish this. Like I've seen it. Like I've seen people do food giveaways, and not just do food giveaways, but work with youth who are formally involved with the criminal legal system as part of the people giving away the food and talking to them. It's like, yeah, in Africa, part of the tribal methodology is you have to serve the community against the people coming to attack the tribe. And they're viewing the food giveaway as a reinstantiation of that African tribal methodology of creating a commitment to the community. So it's a lot harder to be a predator on the community that you've committed to serve. So I've seen that with my own eyes, right? And it's things like that that not only the right, but also the left doesn't see as material, concrete solutions to crime, but it's the only thing that explains what we're seeing in the data.
So when you're saying that when crime is down to the 60-year low, thumbs down, I guess, in LA, this is it. So it's not just that police are in fewer number and arresting fewer people. It's that actual criminal activity is being shown in the data to decrease. Is that just to be clear?
Yeah, and to the last point, the right will make an argument about the data being cooked, and there is an argument that a good chunk of crime is not reported. That is true. But that ratio is pretty consistent going back 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, would they have evidence to show that crime is being less reported now than usual? Like, how would
they're
they
trying to cook
that?
up some controversy over the DC crime data, claiming to be cooking the books. Again, they were cooking the books in the 90s and the 2000s, and generally you cook the books to increase the number of crimes because cops want to say crime is up because we need more money for cops, right? So yeah, it's one of those things where part of the reason we use the murder rate and the shooting rate is that it's very hard to cook the books on those two things. Like, yeah, in theory, you can hide a body in a vacant building, but generally when someone dies, people know, right? When someone gets shot and murdered, people know. So it's the most reliable proxy for what's actually happening is the murder and shooting rates. And those are declining, not just murders, but non-fatal shootings, especially in cities that are taking this approach that I'm taking. And it's important for the left to talk like this because well-meaning people, if they don't feel safe, but all they hear is crime is declining, they're going to say, you're not speaking to my lived experience. And we know propaganda from people like Sinclair Media, who is in DC. They own the ABC station in DC. And what are they saying? They're saying crime is down because of Trump. Crime is down because of the occupation, not because of all the stuff I'm talking about. So it's important to have a story, a narrative that explains to people how to understand the violence numbers within a theory of change that fits within something they can understand. Because again, these folks are linking people to housing services. These folks are linking people to addiction services. So giving more support for them is not trading off with the root cause analysis. It's just showing that we as a community can be in charge more of some of the institutions that engage those root causes. In Newark, I remember it because I've never seen anyone talk about it, not once. They were handing out pamphlets that say ceasefire for the streets on one side. And it's like, do not shoot someone from your community for no reason, mediate conflicts, talk to people about what you need. But on the flip side, it says ceasefire for the suites, like the corporate suites. Like, talk to us about, let's have a movement against the gentrification of Newark. If you're going to have these institutions in Newark, they need to hire returning citizens. So the idea of mobilizing people not just to internalize a vision of self-love and self-care, to not shoot people that look like them, but also to politically activate them against corporate forces as a violence prevention methodology, is not something I've seen talked about anywhere.
So in
But
this effort that you're describing is something that is, so walk me backwards through it again. So because I forgot already the name of the program that you were talking about was that you're saying is related. The use of these funds is related to these
yeah,
people.
American Rescue Plan Act, right?
So
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 ARPA,
ARPA,
yeah. So
it,
that's the big bill that Biden passed that gave
right,
money to cities post the pandemic.
right,
And again, the left has criticized ARPA for, the PPE loans and
right,
the
right,
tax
right.
breaks it gave to businesses, and that's worth criticizing. But it also had direct payments to cities in that ARPA bill.
And is
And
this?
my argument, hmm
I just want to be clear. So the program you're talking about, you were just describing in Newark, is funded by this.
well, they're all funded by a mixture of state, local, philanthropic, and federal funds.
Okay.
My argument is that what ARPA did, and this goes back to the 60s and the community control movement, when money was given directly to cities in the 60s and 70s, for all the talk about Black capitalism co opting Black power, there was also a movement for Black communities to control the poverty programs and to spend that money in a way that actually built up communities. In Baltimore, we had Walter Carter, and we had someone from the core actually invest in neighborhoods and investing in community control of that poverty program money. Now, that was roundly attacked by the nonprofit industrial complex and the liberals, and they wanted control of that money, and they largely got it as a form of backlash to Black power. So part of that is the idea of when those Black rats flipped from city to state, the states had a gatekeeping function that allowed those funds to be taken away from the Black cities as they became majority Black controlled. So ARPA is one of the few times where the federal government has put a multi-billion-dollar investment in cities for local control of that money. And again, we're seeing cities that are Black run, oftentimes by Black neoliberal mayors, that are not necessarily, again, variable in terms of progressive analysis on policing. But as part of the pressure that was put on them by so-called Black Lives Matter and put on them by grassroots advocates, they were forced to invest in a variety of violence prevention programs, including many from the bottom up that never truly received substantial funding before. So that's part of my argument, is that it is the denigration of the value of Black political control in these cities, because we do see folks that are, again, variable on policing, variable on investing in community control, variable on the nonprofit industrial complex, but they were forced to invest in these bottom-up violence prevention programs that were more grassroots. So in Newark, they started this work early. They started this work way before ARPA. They started this work back in like 2014 and 15. So they had more time, and they also had a commitment from, a mayor that comes out of Ross Baraka, from that Black community control tradition, to actually having a battle over contestation of resources that puts grassroots organizations at the center of their violence prevention strategy, which is different even from places like Baltimore, which has big nonprofits tied to big foundations and universities at the center of its system, but also has this grassroots ecosystem they were forced to invest in. So when I bring up Newark, it's not to say that ARPA itself is a magical tool or perfect. It's just an example of the funding mechanism that allowed for investments we had never truly seen before at scale nationwide. So when you talk about LA, when you talk about Philly, when you talk about Baltimore, that federal money going to cities that were Black controlled meant that Black people were able to contest for those resources and force them into grassroots formations to cause the violence declines we're seeing now. And part of my concern is the left correctly looks at the leadership of these cities and says, I don't see much to get excited about. But that ignores the grassroots political contestation on the ground that people are doing to cause outcomes like this, that again have never been seen any other way.
Yeah, I admit. I mean, I just, well, first of all, I just don't know enough of the details in these cities to support my initial hesitance to fully understand or appreciate your argument, especially what has, you know, uh, especially what in light of what has been shown to be so many of the flaws of this black leadership and these black mayors that I'm struggling to see. So, but what I'm also, but what I am also hearing is, again, as I'm distilling what you're saying, I'm hearing, no, this is why the left says more redistribution, because more redistribution allows for more at the local level autonomous use of that redistribution to appease the specific needs of any given community. So that's why to me, what you're arguing, what you're showing is a demonstration of that. And then if we were to have an actual black leadership in these cities and other areas that was not as neoliberal as so many of them are, much more could be done to not only engage in violence prevention and
Hmm.
reduction, but to expand, uh, and improve
Yeah.
the broader conditions. So, but
Yes. So part of
yeah,
my argument is
sure.
that the left has been very imprecise about talking about redistributing power as it redistributes resources. And many of the talking points the left have used in this conversation on crime have not been exclusive of the exact opposite of what I'm calling for, which is bottom up grassroots people having more say and control over who gets funded. In fact, the energy and the talking points that the left have used have been funneled into more top down, nonprofit industrial complex affiliated institutions getting the money. And I fear that's because the left has an anxiety over Black community sovereignty as a productive mechanism because they overdetermine what they see as the failure of neoliberal Black mayors as a reason why Black people having power is something not to be trusted. So in Baltimore, we have violence prevention programs that are um, tied to the public health model that are exported from folks like the University of Chicago that have a veneer of academic legitimacy to it. And much of the left, for its anxieties around neoliberal expertise, does believe in evidence based analysis, does believe in trusting people that have a veneer of leftism in the academy that we should trust them. So the left ends up saying, don't fund the police, fund public health based approaches to public safety. And programs like this one stand up and say, hey, I have the evidence based public health approach. But not only are they not folks utilizing the culture and history of Black people as centered to their methodology, not only are they not using a notion of internalized self hatred and racial self esteem as central to their methodology, they're essentially there to suck up the resources and outcompete and sometimes even poach people from the programs using those exact culturally competent, culturally affirming liberatory methodologies because they have more money, because they have this veneer of academic credibility to it. And the left has not been critical of that. If anything, they've been like supporting those programs getting money because it fits within that conception of how the world should work, which is, this is a good program. Academics I like, my friends are telling me that this program is the best practice, has a bunch of like progressive public health rhetoric to it. And the idea of it being tied to like basically the flip side of this policing regime, the flip side of this prosecutorial regime. This is a program that's been known to like work more with police. Like in Baltimore, we have both our policing ecosystem, so-called GVRS, gun violence reduction strategy. It's like a focused deterrence model. That's a criminology model. That is about criminalizing networks of people in community that may be adjacent to people committing violence and targeting the whole network. But they've basically used their investments in a few programs that do some services. And the service is like, hey, you need to take this job at Amazon. They know you got a gun. They're going to throw you under the jail, and they're going to throw your boys under the jail if anybody shoot anybody. And if you don't take that one Amazon job when they knock on your door, then you and your whole network is going to get, an enhanced sentence because it's a focused deterrence model. And they've basically made that look like public health because it's not broken windows. It's not locking people up for dime bags of weed. And the left has been incredibly imprecise about deconstructing and attacking that co-option because it veils itself in this public health veneer of expertise. And it's not, what they're used to seeing, which is like big burly cops with billy clubs talking about we got to lock everybody up for a dime bag of weed. So there's a sophistication to what it's almost like liberal Zionism. Like you have liberal Zionists that talk about, I don't support mass carpet bombing. I support targeted strikes on known militants in Gaza. It's kind of what they're saying here in America. We support
Obama's drone strikes are precise.
Exactly. But they have like almost like a public health language to it. It's like, these networks are cancer on communities, and we're going to strategically excise the cancer. We're not going to target the whole community. We're going to strategically excise the cancer. And they used to call it weed and seed. DOJ had this program called Weed and Seed, where we take out the criminal networks, we incarcerate them, and then we reinvest in the community after they're gone. Well, what do we know about Malcolm X? What do we know about people using the righteous indignation that leads them to the street as part of their political conscientization? In the Black radical tradition, some of our greatest seeds were considered weeds, right? And we don't have the left speaking around that. They don't have the ability to really be forefront and having conversation about these cultural dynamics because they're all squishy, abstract, and frankly woke. And the left, as part of their anti-woke materialist framework, have completely not just ignored, but at times denigrated the idea that these cultural factors can be material, and therefore not been really interested in investing in programs that are tied to like the Nation of Islam, investing in programs that are tied to religious formations that are seen as regressive and backwards and reactionary, but they don't even know enough about what these programs are doing to even make an informed analysis about what's actually happening on the ground. It just doesn't tickle their leftist funny bones about what they feel should work. So they just have this huge blank spot in their brain about these dynamics, but then they speak with a degree of authority about how we should approach crime and how we should think about things happening in DC without any of this stuff on the table for analysis.
So mayors like Brandon Scott in Baltimore, Ras Baraka in Newark are so they are or would be actually able to redirect ARPA and other similar funding to actual grassroots efforts to actually
they were forced to. So we don't have to have a.
But how do we know? So just for those of us outsiders, how would we know that they're not just funding some other form of a liberal nonprofit under the veneer of some sort of Black grassroots?
Yeah, they're doing some of that too, right? Right. So again, this is not a Pollyanna, eyes wide shut understanding of Black leadership. It is saying that yes, they fund some programs that look more progressive than they are. They fund the mainstream violence prevention programs that work with police. And in this moment, they also were forced to fund some of the more grassroots violence prevention programs that not only have this cultural component to them, but oftentimes, again, explicitly don't work with police. So this is what they call the all of the above approach, right? We're going to fund the police, we're going to fund the big box nonprofits, and we're going to fund the small nonprofits. And that worked fine. No, it didn't really work fine, right? It's like the police, when they work with the feds, it's like even trying to give people services, the feds will say, no, you can't give them services. I'm about to put a case on them. So it's like, how can you claim to work with the people who are directly in the streets when literally the feds can call you off when they want to put a RICO case or put a case on a whole criminal network because the actions of a few people. So this whole all of the above approach, many times the policing gets in the way of the violence prevention. But the violence prevention has been so strong, it's overwhelmed that reality. Now, in the world we're moving into, where economic growth may be slowing, with federal money for even for the big box nonprofits that got federal funding is being cut, there's pressure about who basically to fund and who not to fund. And there's a lot of concern that in a funding crunch, these politically connected, large public health nonprofits are going to basically try to monopolize the funding that would have gone to the small grassroots orgs. So this is not to say we should not have an extreme analysis and skepticism of local networks of Black elected officials. It's the opposite. We should be hyper vigilant to see who they fund, how they construct their ecosystems, and make sure that the grassroots people that don't work with police, that have this cultural, spiritual, political lens to the work they do, get funded as the ARPA money is just running out. ARPA was for like 5 years, and the 5 years is running out. So that's just gone. On top of that, there are federal grants that Trump is cutting. So this is about to be a tight funding environment. And if I would like to see the left show up for investments in those organizations, and I think that would be an example of them taking public safety seriously and showing up for the Black community. But again, that would require them to really see the value in the work these folks are doing and to know enough about it to really see it as part of what it means to deliver on communities' needs in a way that, again, can tie these folks to. These folks are not necessarily against broader redistribution of wealth. They're never engaged when the left is talking about some of these broader redistribution stuff. So again, these people, we know them, we do projects with them, we advocate for them, but we also plug them into the work we're doing around reparations for war on drugs, like obviously, right? Reparations for the opioid funds, like some of the programs that are being funded for violence prevention are getting money from the opioid lawsuit victories Baltimore City had, because again, the impact of addiction is to create conditions for street violence, and we need people to help address that. So we've been very adamant about looking to all these mechanisms of economic redistribution as a way to fund these folks, and we would like to see the left and other places have a similar level of focus and precision about engaging these programs, because if not, again, these folks can turn to the neoliberal Democrats. Like, if the left's not going to support me, I need to get this money to keep my folks alive. And the neoliberal Democrats, they view it as they may actually care, or they may just view it as politically expedient to hold these people up and say, I'm investing in the people on the streets. But we need to block that and link these folks to a more progressive agenda, because that work's not going to stop, whether the left engages them or not. And it only really leaves space for the neoliberals and the centrists to co-opt them. And for the people who view their work and view their work credibly, to say if the left really was about that life, they would be showing up for We Are Us. They'd be showing up for Uncle T. They'd be showing up for programs that are really mediating. I see these people really mediate conflict and save people's lives. You would think people who talk about addressing the legacy of violence and inequality would care about that and really know enough to really see the value in investing in these folks. But they just say less money for police, more money for public health, which means the people who see these programs as a threat to their business model end up sucking up support from that leftist energy.
Lawrence Grandpre, always a pleasure. I really appreciate it. Please, the link to your work and Leaders of Beautiful Struggles in the show description. I love the intellectual challenge. I appreciate it, and the pushing that you often encourage. So, anything else that you would want to make sure that is mentioned before we wrap? That I didn't invite you to say or needs to be said on this issue, and obviously we'll be in.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these folks who are pushing some of these reactionary, tough on crime policies are some of the same folks that pursue, like overt Zionism and the oppression of people around the globe. So again, in Baltimore, we have this huge population of more Zionist supporters of Israel that support these conservative Democrats, right? So part of what we need to do is show the linkages between international oppression and the violence and oppression of people in Baltimore that actually, again, the hyper incarceration of communities causes crime, right? It causes people to go in jail and come out more hardened. If you're part of a street organization, locking somebody up in a street organization just creates a job opening in the underground economy. So you end up just sucking someone from the periphery of that network into the center of that activity that puts them in a proximity to violence. So again, I would want the left to show the connections between international Zionism and colonialism and American violence in Black communities. So I think that's how you get Black folks to really care about what's happening overseas. I'd love to have a conversation with you about that in the future. And really, again, just take seriously, study some criminology. The left doesn't even talk about critical criminology. And the precision and understanding about what actually drives people to shoot someone. Not all hungry people shoot people. Not all homeless people shoot people. It is a complex psychological, spiritual thing that's happening to take somebody's life or to stab somebody. And Black folks have done decades and decades of analysis about these conditions as response to our conditions here in America. You have to be able to at least speak some way fluently about that. If your goal is actually to organize with Black people that are supposed to be the lumpen proletariat to drive the revolution. And I just feel like the inability to speak at all to that reality It's like, are you really trying to organize with the Black community? Or are you trying to use their issues to fit an agenda that would actually serve what you think works and what you want to see that would benefit you, which is this universal redistribution stuff. So again, this is not the last time we're going to talk about it. I appreciate you offering the platform for us, and please check us out on lbsbaltimore.com. Check out our podcast, In Search of Black Power. And we have another podcast that'll be released in a few weeks, Political Commentary Corner, where we're going to go more in depth on some of these dynamics in Baltimore, the Baltimore violence prevention ecosystem, some of these dynamics around local Zionism and the political terrain here, the political race in the 41st District, West Baltimore, between the incumbent Senator Dahlia Attar, who's part of that, gets support from that Zionist network, and Malcolm Ruff, the delegate, who's a civil rights lawyer who just declared a race against her. So some of those ways that you can really plug into local politics to really move this stuff on the ground, because in part Malcolm's running on his support for grassroots violence intervention. So all these things are connected. Zionism, oppression of Black people, local politics, it's all connected. And we appreciate you making space for us and the folks that want to continue to travel along this road to get more understanding of some of these connections and how to plug in and really do some of this work locally as we build nationally and internationally around these issues.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, that set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.